Oh, mate, I was just trying to figure out how to enunciate this one correctly. This is a complicated topic. So a lot of this involves like descriptions of shapes, which are really difficult to know if you don't have a memory bank of 10,000 feet like I do. It's very hard to know what your foot is like, but I'll try and explain this as best I can and look for sort of 3 or 4 of the most important things that you want to look for in a shoe. So we're not talking so much about performance here. We're talking about, because that's obvious. If you are a sprinter or you're looking for the utmost performance in a shoe, you want something light and stiff, right? What we're talking about here is fit, like shape and size and adjustability, stiffness of the upper, this kind of thing. And we'll talk about some of the major brands that you'll see as well and the differences in their shoes. And you've got my old Lake CX237 here, which has been around, I think I've had this shoe for 8 years, still going strong. A few little scuff marks. Big ticks for the longevity of Lake shoes here. These are really, really good. They're made out of kangaroo leather, actually. So, yeah, really, really high quality shoe. So what to look for in shoes? What I think probably the single most important things has got to be toe box width, right? So, you obviously want to make sure the shoe is long enough for your foot, but it's a fairly easy one. When you try the shoe on, if your toes are butting up against the end, it's too small, right? You should have a little bit of clearance to the tip of the shoe with all 5 of your toes, longitudinally I'm talking, if possible. The length is fairly easy. The width, though, is tricky. If you've got a particularly broad forefoot, let's say that your foot is kind of fairly triangle shaped, it splays out quite a lot, and then the toes taper back in at the end, but that forefoot width is quite large. For example, I am a size 42.5, and I believe that the diagonal measurement from the inside of my first metatarsal to the outside of my first metatarsal, so basically a diagonal taken across there, mine's about 112 millimeters, which is slightly above average in terms of width. If you're a 42 and yours is 120, you've got a wide foot, right? Really, really wide. And it scales with regard to foot length as well. So smaller, you know, is a smaller width and so forth. But if you have quite a wide splayed forefoot, toe box width is critical. Any shoe which constricts your foot laterally is going to either hurt or compromise your kind of biomechanics in some way, but usually it'll just hurt. You'll get forefoot numbness, hot foot, that kind of stuff. The best shoes in terms of width I've found has got to be big votes for Lake. Lake make a standard width shoe, which is this one here. Their more modern ones are very, very similar. The standard width in the Lake is quite wide. They also have a wide width, which is spectacularly wide. The wide ones are reserved for the really, really broad-footed, you know, I call them hobbit feet, people with really broad forefeet. Lakes have got to be the widest fitting shoe on the market, or really, really close to it in those wide fit ones. So have a look at Lake if you've got a wide forefoot. The other shoes that are good to look at, Shimano offers an E-fit in a lot of their range, so a wide fit. Bonts are quite wide as well, but Bonts I find are very polarizing because the bathtub construction, the carbon comes up around the side. If you've got a little lump or bump somewhere on your first metatarsal or the outside of your foot here, if it's pressing onto the carbon, they get a bit unpleasant. They are, however, very stiff and very light, and for certain people, they're amazingly comfortable. So Lake, big votes for them. The Shimanos are quite wide as well. There's a couple of smaller manufacturers like the Velo Kicks now from down in Melbourne. They're a reasonably broad, they're sort of a reasonably broad forefoot. So there's other ones as well that suit wide feet, but those are certainly the big 3 to look for if you've got a wide foot. If you've got a particularly narrow foot, you want to gravitate towards shoes, particularly like the narrowest shoes that I've really ever come across are Cities, generally speaking. Now, City do make a Mega, which is really wide, but the standard fit Cities are very narrow. They suit a very long, narrow foot. The foot needs to be fairly straight. If it's got a bit of a longitudinal curve along the long axis like this, the City might not be the best because the foot will effectively be a bit wider than you'd expect because it's curved. But if you've got a long, straight, narrow foot, have a look at Cities. Other shoes that tend to suit that style of foot in the big manufacturers, the North Waves are fairly good for that, Bontrager shoes, that type of thing. But yeah, if you've got a very narrow foot, look for Cities. They will generally be a pretty good system. Next thing to look for, apart from toe volume or toe box width, has got to be, I think, the stiffness of the shoe. If it's really, really stiff, it may actually cause you some trouble. Feet are not designed, or so they haven't evolved to be held in a rigid shoe and moving around and around in a circle like this with no movement. Feet are designed to splay and move like this. It pumps circulation through the foot. It uses the little intrinsic muscles in the arch of the foot, in the bottom of the foot. A really, really, really rigid shoe can actually present trouble for some people. If you've got a super pliable foot, a foot that, like, if your ligaments are really loose, the foot is hyper flexible, the big toe extends a long way, for example. If you've got a foot like this, a really rigid shoe is sometimes not such a great move. Those feet tend to like movement inside the shoe a little bit. You can soften a shoe up by putting a softer insole in, for example. But generally speaking, if the shoe can't flex longitudinally like this one's really rigid. If you've got a very, very pliable foot, sometimes that'll actually be a problem. A very, very rigid foot that just doesn't deform. Your foot hits the ground and it's like a block of wood. They do better in stiff shoes. People will say to me, oh, you know, this stiffer shoe gives me better power transfer. And that's a load of rubbish in general. If you're a World Tour level sprinter, maybe think about that as one of your metrics for your shoe, right? If you're a normal person, what generally tends to happen is as you apply force to the pedal, if the shoe flexes slightly, it acts like a spring, right? It absorbs that tension, and then at the bottom of the stroke, as the force comes off the pedal, the shoe will straighten again and reapply the force to the pedal. So you will get a very, 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 very tiny flattening of the torque curve with a flexible shoe compared to a super rigid, stiff shoe, but it won't actually reduce your outright power. If anyone can measure that difference with a super stiff shoe versus a super flexible shoe, let me know. I'd be open to being proved wrong about that one. But generally speaking, the shoe will act like a spring. And if it's a little bit flexible, it will often give you huge amounts of foot comfort at basically no expense of loss of sprint power. So it does, however, give you a sense of being more powerful because the contact point is just so one-to-one. Yeah. So super rigid shoes are sometimes a bit of a liability. Being able to flex and move a little bit can be hugely beneficial for your foot comfort. Another thing to think about is the vertical height of your midfoot. So this is a bit of a tricky one. Some people, if you've got a very high arch, basically, the midfoot will be very tall off the ground. Looking for a shoe which has a tongue system which can open up a lot vertically. I'll turn that around so it's easy to see. A shoe which can open up a lot vertically with a lot of pliability in the tongue. Very important. For example, Cities, the new generation of Cities have got two boas in the center here and a plate underneath them. They hate a foot with a tall midfoot because the plate can't flex. It's a bit of a strange closure system. If you've got a low profile midfoot, so your arch is not high off the ground, right? What we call a low volume or a low profile midfoot, this is less of a problem. But having a shoe like this Lake, where the tongue is just a single or two layers of leather which can just open right up, you're not going to have any trouble if your forefoot has a high vertical volume. What that will feel like when you put the shoe on is that the front section of the tongue here will just be digging into the front of your ankle gutter a little bit, and it'll feel too crowded, like it's squashing the midfoot down. So those are probably the big three things to look for. And I know the flexibility of the shoe is not one of the things to do with fit, but you are looking primarily for toe box width and tongue pliability in terms of the fit. I guess another thing to look for, which is a bit harder to measure yourself, some feet are curved longitudinally like this bottom of the shoe is a little bit. Other people's feet are very, very straight, right? Look at the bottom of the shoe. If the shoe is fairly curved like that, it will suit a foot with more of a longitudinal curvature than a very straight foot. If your foot is like straight as an arrow and everything's in one line, look for a shoe that's a little bit straighter when you turn it upside down. That's another easy thing to look for. Yeah. So a bit of a complicated topic, and I could waffle on for hours about this one, but we'll try and keep it down to 10 minutes, and hopefully that gives you some kind of an idea of what to look for in the fit of a shoe. Closure systems, like you asked me about before, Craig, they are a little bit of a personal preference thing. Some people hate boas, some people love boas, some people love laces. Try a couple of different ones and see what you prefer. I've never found it to be a big issue for me either way, but my foot is not that touchy with these these things. And some people, though, if they've got a really unusual forefoot that the foot drops down from a high arch and then the forefoot is very flat, they need a really unusual closure system to be able to close down around both sections of the foot. Sometimes that is something to think about, but those are the very unusual outliers. That's certainly not commonplace to be a problem. So let's say you've tried a shoe on in the shop and you've found that it's too tight around your foot laterally, and the shop assistant suggests you just go up a size. Exactly what you're asking. This happens all the time. You go up a size, your toes are 10 millimetres off the end of the shoe, so it's 2 or 3 sizes too big, but you've got the width that you want because you've got a wider forefoot than that shoe would suit. What the big downside here, the biggest one, is that it moves the 3 bolt locations forward along the shoe. As the shoe gets bigger, those bolt locations move with the shoe. So you can get into a situation where even with the cleat pulled as far back as you can possibly get it, it's still way too far forward relative to where your foot is in the shoe. So you basically come across cleat positioning problems when the shoe is too long. Is the big thing there. And you can sort of mitigate that a bit. You can go around it by using extender plates and things to get it back. But the best thing to do is to just find a shoe with a wider toe box that's in the correct length for you. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah.